Hello, my name is Ryan Biagini, and I am the Director of Community Engagement and Education with Hospice of the Piedmont and Hospice of Randolph. Welcome to the E-Series, an educational webinar series aimed at engaging our community, exploring relevant topics, and educating about ways to connect with our organization. Today's webinar, Life Matters, a conversation starter, is presented by our CEO, Trent Cockerham, and we'll get started right after this brief introductory video. I hope you enjoy.
Life Matters, a conversation starter. And before we get started, I want to show you a brief video.
Coming up on Aging Matters End of Life.
I think we're dealing with deep-rooted natural human fear of dying. No one wants to die.
He didn't want it, and it didn't help him, but I thought it was. So was I doing it for him or was I doing it for me? I don't know.
We are in danger of consuming a lot of resources for care that isn't efficient or provides the kind of care that people really want.
I've had a good run. I've enjoyed life. That's the way to go. Just let nature take its course.
We are going to have a large number of people who need hands-on care every day. We are going to have to figure out how to function with that.
So that's actually a video from our friends over at Nashville Public Television. You can actually view the entire series on YouTube by just looking up Aging Matters End of Life Nashville Public Television. It's free to watch. It's a really great video. But one of the things that always strikes me every time I see it is this notion of that we are sort of terrified of talking about concepts related to death and dying. That is really a terrifying consideration, right? For many people, we oftentimes don't talk about it until we're faced with a crisis. And we are sometimes, I've been in healthcare for over almost 25 years, we are at a crossroads where we're at a point where we have the potential to consume significant amounts of healthcare resources, oftentimes that are completely inconsistent with our wants, needs, and priorities, which is really what we're going to spend some time talking about today. You know, our organization is a hospice care organization, Hospice of the Piedmont, and our affiliate organization, Hospice of Randolph. Simply put, in the most fundamental of senses, what we do each and every day is connect individuals in the family and their families to the care they need on the terms they choose. That's really what we do. But we cannot escape, just as you saw in the video, an unmitigated reality. It's an undisputed fact. I think this is a great cartoon. I always love to show this in community settings. You have this guy who's lying there in bed. He's clearly very ill. He's got a long line of people waiting outside the room to see him. And he says, hey, my parents died, their parents died, and their parents died. It runs in the family. And as we think about our life, isn't that really true? You know, oftentimes people are really afraid to talk about death and dying, because if they think about talking about it, it means that they may invite it into the room. And clearly this guy is really defying that construct altogether, because he's saying, hey, this is normal. My parents, it happened to them, it happened to their parents, it absolutely runs in the family. And as an organization, we truly do understand that death is a natural part of the life cycle. But it's difficult for us to talk about. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. But before we get sort of to why we think it might be difficult, or why Trent might think it might be difficult, or why we as an organization think it might be difficult, I think it's important for us to think about sort of a few things. And so I've got a couple of illustrations that I want to show you, how we live and how we die. So if you imagine you've got a graph here on the left, and you've got age across the bottom, you've got end of life over here. I think everybody can see my cursor as it moves across the screen. You've got this really nice, long, sloping arc, right? That's sort of what we would consider to be what happens when you age gracefully, you get old, and you die. Sort of what we would have always considered as dying from old age. We live to a very long life for an incredibly long span of time, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, and then we pass away, we die. That's what we all think about, right? There are a couple different other options, though, that I want to share with you. This one, for example, got health over here, you've got age down here, you've got end of life over here, and you've got this sort of, you age out for a bit, and then something really sudden happens. It could quite literally be that you fall off a cliff. I mean, it's not difficult to imagine that if you fell off a cliff, you might in fact die. It's also not difficult to imagine that if you had a really significant accident, like a motor vehicle accident, for example, that might be the reason that you die. It could also be something really catastrophic, like a sudden catastrophic illness, like a heart attack, or a stroke, or any number of other things that can happen really suddenly, like a significant illness of incredibly short duration that could lead to the cause of death. That's a possibility. But there's another thing that we have to think about. Look at this, for example. This graph here, you've still got health on the left, you got age at the bottom, you got end of life over here on the far right. You live a period of time, and then what happens is you have a period of sickness. Then you have a period of wellness, period of sickness, period of wellness, better period of wellness, slight illness, significant improvement, a decline again, little bit of improvement, decline again. So you get on down here, and I don't want to ascribe an age to this because this really could be at any time, but oftentimes we see it after someone reaches, say, about 65 to 75 years of age or even older. They begin to have, particularly if they have chronic health conditions, they begin to experience significant periods of illness. The periods of illness get longer, the periods of wellness get shorter, the periods of sickness and periods of wellness get closer together. The periods of sickness, as I mentioned, get longer, the periods of wellness get shorter, and it sort of all collapses onto itself, and we wind up at end of life. Now, that's been my experience in healthcare, having worked now for over almost 25 years, caring particularly for a senior population. This has been what I have seen most people experience, particularly individuals who are living with advanced chronic illnesses. And we'll talk a little bit about those today. But I think that's a really important consideration, that many people, I would posit to say most people, actually live this experience that you're seeing on your screen. They're living for a while, they're developing some chronic illness, whether it's from lifestyle choice or just from bad genetics or any host of a number of other considerations that can befall us as we get older. And we begin to get sick, we have wellness, we begin to get sick, and the cycle really repeats itself over and over again. And if we begin to think about the troughs, each of these periods of illness, as being a hospitalization, for example, which is often the case as we get further down into this trajectory here, then it becomes more complicated, right? Becomes more complicated for the patient, becomes more complicated for those who are caring for them, and it becomes a consideration oftentimes for the family of how do we support this? And what does that look like? And what are our options? What's really interesting is of course, who work in hospice care, what's really interesting is you take someone who's on that same roller coaster ride, as I would call it, and you find themselves down further into this trajectory, and you lay over hospice into that trajectory at some point. And you see that curve sort of smooth out a bit. People begin to feel better. Their quality of life improves, which is not unheard of for us to take care of incredibly ill patients who are on our service. But their quality of life improves. Their symptom burden decreases. The ability for their family to care for them in a more productive manner improves. The caregiving burden for the family lessens. All of those are things that we experience as we care for individuals in our hospice care. And so I think that's really interesting. In studies, time and time again, since the hospice Medicare benefit was enacted into legislation in 1986, have shown that hospice patients, on average, live about 25% longer than individuals with the same diagnosis who don't receive hospice care, which is astounding because that's not always something that we think about. So we sort of got these four different ways, right? The three that we see over here, sort of the long sloping arc of old age, this chronic period of chronic illness, and then this acute sudden event. And then we've got what happens when hospice is overlaid, particularly into an individual's life who may be on this roller coaster ride, as I would call it. And so we begin to ask ourselves, why is it so complicated for us to talk about these things? It's a fact, you saw in the cartoon, that death happens to all of us, but why is that so complicated? Well, we have to think about who we are as individuals. We have to think about permission. And, I think about permission and always asking my mom if I could go do something. And oftentimes she said, well, I don't know, go ask your daddy. And I'd ask my dad and he'd say, I don't know, go ask your mom. That's not the real permission that I'm talking about. I'm talking about permissions related to really important discussions. Now, if I'd opened this conversation today and for the first 5 minutes, I sat here and just laughed uncontrollably, you all probably would have all signed off thinking the man that they had talking was insane. Why would you think that? Because nobody said anything funny. Ryan hadn't told a joke. He hadn't given me permission to laugh. And the same is true when we think about difficult conversations. Let's figure out a way to give someone permission to talk with us about that. Because having discussions about end-of-life care and death doesn't invite it into the room. But we must have permission to talk about it. It's a known fact that conversations about death and dying and end of life are the costliest conversations that we as Americans are not having. 62% of bankruptcies in America are due to medical expenses. That was reported by a Harvard University study several years ago. And most Americans, this is an astounding consideration, most Americans will spend 43% of the value of their net assets during the last year of their life. And so don't we owe it to ourselves? Don't we owe it to our children? Don't we owe it to our spouses? Don't we owe it to those who are important in our life to have these really important conversations? You have to think about that, because understanding your healthcare options is key to really keeping you in the driver's seat when it comes to living better. So let's talk about living and planning. Organizing and talking about your wants, needs, and priorities, which is what we're talking about today, related to your healthcare, gives you complete control. And in actuality, lessens the emotional burden for those who are making the decisions, because you have already made those decisions. And if you've already made those decisions, you've already given them permission to talk to you about it. So you've arrived at your destination before you ever needed to make those decisions. Because anyone who's ever bought a car can appreciate that when you are in need of a car and you put it off and you put it off and you put it off, and suddenly the car you're driving dies and is irreparable, you don't have the opportunity to shop for what you think you want, for what you think is going to work best for your life. You're left with buying whatever is the most available thing on the lot that you happen to go to. Now, I would ask all of you to think about whether or not, if you wanted a new car and you said, Trent, I want you to go buy me a new car, and I went and bought you a new car, how pleased would you be with it? Now, some of you would probably say, I'd be delighted, Trent, if you'd go buy me a new car. But once you got it, you said, well, wait a minute, it doesn't have power windows, doesn't have a moonroof, it's the color I don't like the seats, kind of uncomfortable, they don't really sit well for my back. You know, I don't like the way this feature works, it doesn't have a great radio. It doesn't have all the features that you want on it because you didn't buy it. But when we don't make decisions related to our healthcare in advance, that's sort of what we're asking people to do. And most people really wouldn't be okay with someone else just going out and buying a car for them and giving it to them unless they've had opportunity to sit down and ask them what features they want, what's important to them. So, you know, it's important to actually lessen those emotional burdens for those who are actively engaged in your care, and engage your doctor in these conversations because they are an incredibly important partner for you. What's so interesting about that is findings from a study in about 2016 or so found that out of 736 physicians from all 50 states said 99% of them said it was important that healthcare providers have these conversations with their patients. But 48% say they're frequently unsure of what to say during those conversations about advanced care planning or end-of-life care. And another 46% said they didn't want to talk, they didn't want those in their care to give up hope. This is from a physician's perspective, or have them think that their doctor was giving up on them. Yet, we know that those are the costliest conversations that we as Americans are not having. You might think, well, gosh, why is it so difficult for a physician to have this conversation? Oftentimes, it's for the same reason we don't as individuals, because we haven't given them permission to talk to us about it. Let's give them permission to have that conversation because they know that it is important. But they are also human, so it might be really difficult for them to figure out how to ask you as the patient for permission to ask those questions. That was from a physician's views towards advanced care planning and end-of-life conversations. It was a research sponsored by the John Hartford Foundation at Cambria Health. It's really important. So I want you to consider, these questions. Nope. Well, for whatever reason, that's not going to show up, but consider these questions. What kinds of things are important to you in your life? If you weren't able to do the activities that you enjoy, are there medical treatments that would be too much? Some people would say, if it makes me feel this way, I'm good. If it makes me feel that way, that's not what I want. Completely inconsistent with my needs, wants, and priorities. What fears do you have about getting sick or medical care? Are there cultural or guiding principles, spiritual or religious beliefs, or other philosophical beliefs that you have that may inform your choice of medical decisions? And then if you had to choose between living longer or having a better, higher quality of life, which would you pick? Is the hope of a longer life better than the hope of a life that has more quality? I think those are considerations you have to think. I've had many families in my career ask me those same questions because they're unsure. But what I can tell you is, in every case, when a mom or dad in my experience, has made those decisions already known, the children or the spouse are at peace because they've already given each other permission to have these conversations. And then more importantly, does it matter where your end of life happens? Is that important to you? Some people would say it is, I don't want to die at home, I want to die in a hospital. I don't want to die in a nursing home, I want to die at home. These are all things that inform these considerations. One caveat to that, however, is don't ask individuals who are going to make decisions for you to do things that are out of their control. That's something that we'll explore in another series later, but I think that's an important consideration. So let's talk a little bit about palliative care and hospice care. So it's real interesting. 78% of Americans have often never heard of palliative care, and I would wager to say, and this happens in my own family, that the other 22% actually believe it's hospice care. The reality is the two are incredibly different. Related, but different. Palliative care is a medical specialty that focuses on symptom management, helping patients and families establish complex goals of care. What are your needs, wants, and priorities as it relates to your disease? And help patients better coordinate their healthcare services. Because oftentimes, there are many different medical providers involved in one patient's care, which can be confusing, which can be complicated, and which can be difficult to navigate. And so what is hospice care? Hospice care is a benefit that's covered by Medicare, Medicaid, and most insurance companies. And P.S., it comes with little to no out-of-pocket expense, which is tremendous. It's an incredibly rich benefit. It covers physician services, drugs related to the hospice condition, medical supplies, durable medical equipment like beds and oxygen concentrators, and all of those things that are really essential that help improve the caregiving experience and also that help improve the living experience. I think that's really important consideration too, as well as the services of a visiting nurse, a physician, a nursing assistant, a social worker, a whole team of people who are really assembled just for the care of an individual, and also a chaplain. Because spirituality and existential considerations are really important at end of life. Also includes volunteers and a host of other people that work together to provide the care and services and coordinate the health care that individuals need, all for little to no out-of-pocket expense. Many people think, gosh, 6 months is the maximum benefit, right? Because you have to have a 6-month prognosis, which means I'm only going to be able to be in hospice for 6 months. That's not true. There are many patients who are in a hospice program, in our hospice program, for example, who are in our program for much longer than 6 months. In fact, if you think about what I said earlier, that on average, patients who receive hospice care live about 25% longer than patients who didn't receive hospice care with the same diagnosis. That oftentimes mean that they're going to live much longer than 6 months. Some live longer, some live shorter periods of time. It all depends on where the patient is in their trajectory. It also all depends upon what their needs, wants, and priorities are, which also informs when they come into our service. Here's a better way to look at it. If you think about palliative care as a medical specialty, we take everything that palliative care does, expert symptom management, establishing complex goals of care, helping people understand their needs, wants, and priorities, helping them coordinate their healthcare services. And we bundle it all together with all of those other ancillary services: a nurse, a chaplain, a social worker, a nursing assistant, a physician, medications, medical supplies, durable medical equipment. We bundle it all together. We take everything we know about palliative care and we bundle it all together in a benefit, and we've created hospice. And I think that's a really great way to understand the difference between palliative care and hospice care. So, gosh, we've come back here to how we live and how we die. And as I mentioned, this is the most common scenario that I experienced in my entire healthcare career. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I want you to meet Mabel, this lovely lady on the left. She's a 75-year-old female. She has stage 4, which is end-stage congestive heart failure. You know, many people would think hospice is really just for cancer patients, and actually only about 33% of more than 2,000 patients that our organization cares for in a year actually has cancer. The other 67% have many other conditions. About 50% of them have some form of cardiopulmonary disease, just like Mabel. So she got stage 4 congestive heart failure. She's got other chronic diseases. She's got COPD. She has diabetes. She's got dementia. She was a smoker of 30 plus years. In the most recent 12 months, now I want you to think about that roller coaster that I showed you earlier. Mabel has had 6 emergency department visits and 4 hospitalizations. I would wager to say that every single person joining us today knows someone like Mabel, if in fact they do not know Mabel themselves. Maybe it's a family member. Mabel's primary caregiver is her 79-year-old husband, Sam, who has the beginnings of dementia but is otherwise healthy. And all of their children live out of state. This is a very common scenario. Now, this is an experience for Mabel. She's got over here traditional disease management. She's got maybe 2 to 10 doctors, maybe 25 to 35 different medications, not unheard of for individuals who are coming into our service. She has no home support. Sam, who has the beginnings of dementia, as I mentioned, who he himself is an elderly caregiver. And all the children live out of state. So Sam has a difficult time probably taking care of Mabel. And so what happens with Mabel, someone who has dementia, diabetes, COPD, stage 4 heart disease or congestive heart failure, they have what we call a predictably unpredictable care crisis. What does that mean? That seems like so oxymoronic. Well, it is exactly what it is. It is something that we in a healthcare field could predict is a reasonable eventuality for Mabel. But for her family, they feel like it is incredibly unpredictable. Just like all of the 6 ED visits and 4 hospitalizations she had in the most recent 12 months. So what happens? She has a predictably unpredictable care crisis. She has an ambulance ride. She goes to the ER. She has a hospital stay. She might go for a little bit for rehab or a long-term care facility. She might get some home health for just a little bit, maybe 1 to 6 visits. And then we find ourselves back here. And this is a cycle. If you think about the roller coaster graph that I showed you earlier, this is a cycle that repeats oftentimes for many years, if not decades. Only the cycle begins to repeat much more rapidly as we begin to approach end of life. It's really interesting. So let's look at Mabel's last hospitalization. Sam, her husband, found her unresponsive. He called 911. Mabel was admitted to the ICU. The husband and children said, do everything. Because in the absence of any other discussion, that is the default premise. Do everything. Mabel was admitted, spent 4 days in the ICU and another 5 days in acute care where she died. This is not an uncommon scenario. Many of you who've joined me today may know someone who fits this scenario perfectly because it is not uncommon. So then we begin to ask ourselves, what led Mabel down this path? Was it consistent with her needs, wants, and priorities? We don't know. Because they never sat down and talked about what was important to Mabel or her end of life. Simply wasn't anything they talked about. You know, when we think about Mabel, when we think about being in the ICU, we oftentimes conjure images of what it looks like on television. right? But that's really disconnected from the reality of what's happening in an ICU, particularly for someone who has dementia, who isn't completely aware of the surroundings that they're in. Or if they are aware, they're at least aware enough that these are really different surroundings for them, filled with different sounds and sights that are so unfamiliar that they are incredibly, incredibly difficult for them to comprehend. But Sam and Mabel and their family never talked about what Mabel wanted at her end of life. Now, what would have been a different outcome for Mabel? Possibly, could have been, if her family had had a conversation. If at some point along this trajectory, this roller coaster, they had said, let me have hospice. Let's talk to hospice. Let's talk to Hospice of the Piedmont. Let's talk to Hospice of Randolph. Let's talk about, first and foremost, what our needs are for our mom or for my spouse. Something to think about. You know, this is a great bit of cathartic comedy. You have this guy who says, if my bill goes over $30,000, he's talking to the doctor, just pull the plug, right? He's making an economic decision for his health care. The reality is, in Mabel's case, for example, just because she was in the ICU didn't mean there was a plug to pull, because oftentimes there isn't a plug to pull. So when you're beginning these conversations, when you're beginning to talk with your spouse or your mom or your dad or people who are important in your life that you think you may ask to make healthcare decisions for you, we will say oftentimes, well, if I'm like that, just pull the plug. But being like that oftentimes isn't the reality, because the reality is oftentimes the roller coaster that we're on as we go through life, particularly as we have chronic diseases and as they advance with our age. A couple other things I want to make mention of. This is a really interesting set of statistics. I want to talk a little bit about CPR. And this is not to pick on CPR. CPR is a perfectly wonderful thing. You know, it's saved many, many lives. If I were to fall out of this chair today, I would hope someone would rush into the room and it would play out live right on camera. It would be, you know, I'm sure it would get rave ratings, right? I want someone to give me CPR. Now, I'm 46 years old. What I want at 46 and what I want at 76 are two totally different things. So let's talk about that. You know, the interesting thing is we have to ask ourselves, are we Olympic athletes? I always ask myself that. I'm not an Olympic athlete, right? They're in the top 1% of all the population. Most people probably fall into the 50th percentile of sort of what could befall us at any given time, right? And so survival statistics related to CPR are really important. If you're younger than 70 years old, there's about a 12.6% chance that you're going to survive CPR with good neurologic function or minimal deficits upon discharge. This is from a hospital. Which means on the other side of that is that there's an 87.4% chance that it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. That's terrifying even for me, because I'm younger than 70 years old. But look at what happens as you get older. At greater than 85 years of age, it's a 4.5% chance of patients surviving with good neurologic function or minimal deficits upon discharge, which means there's a 95, almost 96% chance that that is not going to be the case. Statistics are interesting things. We all want to believe that we're in the top 10% of all performers, but the reality is we're mostly all just average people. Now, there are outliers to all of this. I submit that to you. But I give this to you only as an example, as an illustration of why having conversations, thoughtful conversations, beginning difficult conversations is so very important. In a long-term care setting, there's a less than 3% chance of survival after CPR is performed. And in a hospital, slightly more than 2% of all patients who survive CPR have normal mental functioning. Those are really current statistics. They've not been updated in some time. You know, medical advances are wonderful. They can do wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things, except keep us from getting older, and in many cases, keep us from dying. Because even all the tools in a physician's toolbox are limited. And most of the time, if you ask any physician, 9 times out of 10, if you ask the question, "Doctor, would you rather do something to me as opposed to do something for me if I were seriously ill?" the answer would be the latter as opposed to the former. They'd much rather know what you would like for them to do for you as opposed to your understanding what they could do to you, just like in Mabel's case. Let's talk about a few statistics. 90% of people say that talking about end-of-life care is extremely important, but only 27% have actually done so. 60% of people say that making sure their family isn't burdened by complicated care decisions is extremely important. But 56% of people haven't communicated this in writing. 80% of people say that if they are seriously ill, they would talk to their doctor about their end-of-life care. But astoundingly, only 7% of people have actually had an end-of-life conversation. 82% of people say it's important to have their wishes in writing, but only 23% have actually done it. Those are astounding statistics, aren't they? It's an interesting juxtaposition, as we've talked about, needs, wants, and priorities. And hopefully, I'm sparking some thoughts in your minds today. And we're going to move quickly through a couple of these other things. I want to keep us on track today. But the benefits of planning are it gives control to the individual. It lessens uncertainties and assumptions for loved ones. It would have been easy in Mabel's case. If Sam had known what Mabel wanted, or even if their children who lived out of state knew what Mabel wanted. Or perhaps even if her healthcare provider knew what Mabel wanted. It ensures that you're an important stakeholder in the decisions for how you want to live and be treated. Think about giving me the permission to go buy you a car. You're going to get all the features that I want you to have, perhaps not the features that you want. Planning for your healthcare ensures that you are the person who's making all of the decisions, in this case for the car that you want, and not relying on someone else to make those decisions for you. Allows for close family and friends to have an understanding of your wishes. Isn't that really important? We hope that's the case. Helps your physicians understand ahead of time the goals that you have for your care. Because it isn't their goal, isn't their care. They'd much rather do what you want them to do. You know, don't leave your healthcare to chance. Make your wishes known. For all the reasons that we've already talked about, advanced care planning, making your wishes known, reduces stress and anxiety and depression for patients and their families. Consistently, that is always the case. So a few commonly used healthcare terms, and I should have mentioned at the very beginning of this that all of the information that I'm giving you today is not a substitute for legal or medical advice, and any healthcare decisions you make should be made in consultation with your family physician or attending physician, and in consultation with your family or your loved ones. In addition to that, all legal decisions that you would make should be made in consultation with an attorney or appropriate legal counsel. But a few things that we might hear about and that you have an opportunity to hear about on August 7th, which is coming up in a couple weeks, when Kat Gibson, our Vice President of Family Care Services, has another e-series called Living Smart, Understanding Advanced Directives. But I'll give you a little bit of a preview. She's going to talk about all of these in much greater detail. But a living will, also known as a declaration for desire of natural death, that's completed by an individual, by a patient, and it explains what their wishes are. Now, healthcare power of attorney, we hear a lot of that. We talk a lot about that in healthcare. A healthcare power of attorney is also a legal document. It tells your healthcare providers, all the people who may be taking care of you, who you wish to make decisions for you and on your behalf in the event you are unable to make decisions. And then a most form, which is a medical order for scope of treatment. That's what it's called in North Carolina. It's based on an individual's wishes, much like a living will, but is completed by a physician in consultation with a patient and outlines in some detail what the patient would like to have done in the event that they have a sudden illness. Now, I'm not going to go into greater detail than that, but those will be topics that will be talked about in Living Smart, Understanding Advanced Directives on August the 7th by Kat Gibson. So I want to put some good reads and great resources up on here for you. North Carolina Secretary of State, Understanding Advanced Healthcare Directive Registry. Those of you who are going to join us, join Kat and Ryan at 12 p.m. on Friday, August 7th, may want to take a look at that in advance of learning more about that. Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. It's a New York Times bestseller written by physician and surgeon Dr. Atul Gawande, who practices at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston and is also on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. And it sort of outlines his experience as a physician, as a surgeon, but then also as a son in dealing with his own family's end-of-life issues, more specifically related to his dad and his dad's having been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor, and how they went through many of the decision points that we've talked about today, and how difficult that was for him and what his experience was inside the medical system. The Conversation, a revolutionary plan for end-of-life care, also by a physician, which is really great. The Conversation Project, with whom we are a community partner, founded by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ellen Goodman, after she experienced end-of-life for her mother and having to make decisions for her. And she felt like it was an incredibly important consideration that every single person in the country should do. And then Let's Have Dinner and Talk About Death. This is really a permission-based exercise. This is how you can engage people in your family or your friends, people who are important to you, in having a lighthearted but incredibly important and very poignant discussion about life and end of life and things that are really, really important to you. And then lastly, I'll leave you with this. As you all know today, you joined us. We are Hospice of the Piedmont and our affiliate organization, Hospice of Randolph. We are Hospice. Know us by our name. We are a great resource. I hope what you've learned today has been impactful for you. I still want to remind everybody there's an opportunity to post questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in just a moment. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today, and I am going to turn this back over to Ryan Biagini.
Hey, thank you, Trent, and thank you again for being with us. We do see a couple of these questions. We had one question about the book Being Immortal by Dr. Atul Gawande, and Trent just spoke to that book and shared a few other resources. So, David, you're in good company, and you've made a great decision in reading that book, and hopefully you can pick up some of the others he recommended. I see Elizabeth may not have been able to stick around for the end of the webinar, but we will be sure to get a hold of you. We've got your phone number and email from your registration, and we'll be glad to follow up with you. we'll just give you all just a moment or two. If you have any other questions that you'd like to type into the Q&A or type into the chat. We have a great resource and plethora of knowledge in Trent here. And so while you have them at your disposal, feel free to type in a question. As a quick reminder, I do hope that you're able to join us on August 7th for our presentation on living smart and understanding advanced directives. As Trent mentioned, it'll be a great opportunity to learn more and to even make some personal decisions yourself, maybe as you kind of consider these topics. Wanted to let you also know that we'll be sending a survey out this afternoon with some follow-up, an opportunity for you to give us feedback. This is our first installment of the E-Series, and we cherish the opportunity to improve and to grow as this series continues. And so if you would take that survey for us, you'll see it in your inbox this afternoon, and it'll just give us an opportunity to improve as this E-Series continues.
Ryan, there's one question here in the Q&A box that I might take a bit of privilege, if you don't mind,
Please.
just to answer. Are all hospice organizations or all hospice the same? There are so many throughout the country. That's absolutely accurate. What's really interesting is in our own 8-county service area, there are about 22 or so different hospice organizations, and there is a mix of for-profit and not-for-profit hospice organizations. We're not all connected to each other. I think that's really interesting. There's a great misconception in and among a lot of people in our community and across the nation that all hospice organizations are connected to each other, and we're actually not. We actually are not connected to one another financially. We just oftentimes share a name, just like a hospital would share a hospital in its name. Hospice is a moniker of the services that we provide, but we're not connected to them. And the way we go about delivering hospice care in our organization is going to be incredibly different than the way hospice care is delivered by any other organization. You know, as a nonprofit community-supported organization which relies on the generosity of the communities that we serve to help support our organization and the needs of our patients and their families and all of our services, I think it's important to note that we really care deeply about what happens with our patients and their families. And unlike many other hospice providers, we don't have shareholders or stakeholders. We have stakeholders, but not shareholders. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. So as you're asking for hospice or thinking about hospice as a method of care for you or someone you know, someone in your family, please give us a call. We are happy to talk with you about how we may be able to be of service to you. That is a great question, and I really do appreciate that. I think there's a raised hand, but if you could, I'm not sure how that works. Let's go back to that. What's the latest one can register for one of these E-Series Friday webinars? I believe that's 11:30 for a 12 p.m. start.
Yes, you can register really up until the doors open. We would recommend you do so sooner than later, as we will try to start promptly at 12. But yes, you can register up until right before the webinar goes live at noon.
A couple more questions here, Ryan, in the chat box. If I or my loved one selects hospice care, can I or they change their mind, or is it until the end? Absolutely not. You know, the great thing about hospice is that it is incredibly, one, portable. It can be delivered anywhere in an individual's home or wherever they call home. They can opt out of receiving hospice care, just like you can opt out of going to the doctor or opt out of any sort of care that you want to opt out of. So you can change your mind at any time. That's often not the case. Many people come into our program and have an opportunity to experience the full breadth of all of the services that we can offer, and surround them with an incredibly supportive methodology of care, and they decide that this is the right approach to care, that they would like, and they like to continue with that. But that's a great question. Why is 6-month life expectancy to be accepted in the hospice program? Is that a Medicare requirement? You know, that is absolutely a Medicare requirement. In 1986, when hospice was legislated into law, in fact, let me back up just a few years before that, our organization was formed in 1981, when really there were no hospice rules. It was really just a movement. We were started by a handful of volunteers who really believed and understood that people who were at or approaching the end of their life had a really unique set of needs, a unique set of medical needs, social needs, psychosocial needs, spiritual needs, and not only did they, but also their families. So it is a holistic type of care delivery. We're treating the patient, the individual, but we're also providing services to all those individuals who are around the patient. So their family, the patient and the family become the unit of care. So as hospice organizations evolved, the United States Congress did what the United States Congress does. In 1983, they did a demonstration project to sort of understand the efficacy of this hospice program that had sort of evolved from about 1974 in this country up until the early 80s or mid 80s, as it were. They needed to understand if they needed to have a separate benefit for hospice. And what they learned, what they discovered was pretty astounding. They actually learned that people who are in hospice, as I've mentioned, lived longer, felt better, and incidence of depression among their family who was caring for them was significantly better, and the caregiving burden was significantly less. And then what I call the what's in it for me factor, as Congress is sort of thinking about how they would extend financing or payments for this new type of care that they were contemplating, they looked at what the utilization of hospice care patients were. So they had felt better, they lived longer, their families had a much better caregiving experience, both during and then after the patient's death. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the what's in it for me factor, they actually consumed fewer resources in the healthcare system. So it actually cost the healthcare system less. So when they legislated hospice into law, they said 6 months, which seems pretty arbitrary to me, but 6 months is the federal requirement. So that is a consideration of federal law. So an individual must have a certification, a physician must certify that every patient that is in a hospice program has an estimated prognosis of 6 months. But that does not mean that 6 months is the maximum benefit, as I mentioned. Many patients stay longer, some patients stay shorter periods of time. It really just depends upon where they are in the trajectory of their illness. That is a great question. Thank you so much, Danny. Oh, there's one more. So is the advantage to specify the hospice facility that you want? Absolutely. You know, I want to make a couple of distinctions here, Linda. We have 2 hospice inpatient facilities. We have Hospice Home at High Point. We have Randolph Hospice House. And we provide a very different level, a much more acute level of care in those environments. But so I want to make a distinction between hospice care and hospice facility. Because when we talk about hospice facility, we're talking about Hospice Home at High Point or the Randolph Hospice House. But you are absolutely correct. You should ask for us by name. Ask for Hospice of the Piedmont, ask for Hospice of Randolph when you're beginning your considerations. You can read about us online at www.hospiceofthepiedmont.org or www.hospiceofrandolph.org. Either of those, you can read about us. It also gives you information on how you can contact us, and we can sit down and have a conversation with you. Appreciate that question. Once groups are allowed to gather socially, will you and your organization speak to groups or provide videos for presentation? We would absolutely love to do that. That's actually Ryan, my colleague, who you met earlier. That's actually part of his role in his department, the Community Engagement and Education Department. We would absolutely love that. Just in this time of needing to be socially distant, we thought that this would be a great opportunity for us to do this. However, if you have a group that can host a webinar, we would be happy to do that for you too, I would wager to say. So you can send us an email at info@hospiceofthepiedmont.org or info@hopnc.org. And we'll try to send that out also in the follow-up email with the survey in case you have any additional information that you'd like to request from us. We appreciate that. We always appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk with groups who are interested in hearing about what we do. Ryan, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Great. If there are no other questions, we do appreciate you joining with us today on behalf of Hospice of the Piedmont, Hospice of Randolph, and the Community Engagement and Education Department. Thank you. And we do hope to see you in a couple weeks for our next session of the E-Series. Have a great day.